In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day.
This is how God starts his creation. Heaven and earth, light and darkness, the firmament, the seas and all the dry land. It didn't just come to be out of nothing. God made it.
And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind." And the earth brought forth grass, and God saw that it was good.
This is how the Bible tells it. A world history book that is most unique. Millions of people have folded their hands upon it and found inner peace. Creation is the first subject of the first book in the Bible, Genesis. No complicated cosmogonies, no wild prehistoric chaos with wrestling or copulating gods, no monsters who create the world, but God, who speaks and it comes to pass. The Bible is a curious book. People have fought against it with all their might. Others freely offered their lives for it as martyrs. Why? Because they felt that the content of this book was more important than their own lives. No book in this world has been read by more people. No book has been translated into more languages. No book has been distributed in larger quantities. And no book had more influence upon the history of mankind than this same Bible. How did the Bible come into being? How do we know for sure that we still possess the original Bible? Who wrote the Bible anyway? We will embark upon an exploration as to the beginnings of the Bible, so let's start right there. The first 5 books of the Bible are written in the silence of the desert, just by one man, Moses. Moses begins with Genesis and writes about creation and about the first human beings. He describes how it went wrong between men and God, how man preferred to decide for himself what was right and wrong, rather than leaving it up to God. Moses also shows the logical consequence of all this when the first violent death on earth takes place and Cain murders his brother Abel. And so the book of Genesis continues. Moses writes about the incredible catastrophe that hit the world and annihilated all life, the flood. But at the same time, he wrote about Noah and his family and about the animals in the ark who survived this catastrophe. After the flood, life starts afresh, and we read about how people spread themselves over the face of this earth. Then it talks about Abraham, who was called by God to depart from Ur of the Chaldees with his whole family, lock, stock, and barrel, sheep and goats, to go to the promised land that God would show him. And so Abraham left with his wife, servants, and all of his livestock. It meant a long trip through a barren desert to the promised land of Canaan. Now, how did Moses know what had happened on the face of this earth, including those events before his time, since he certainly did not experience everything himself he wrote about? Modern Bible scholars say it was by word of mouth. The old histories were orally delivered from father to son, and Moses had really nothing to do with it. So, not in Moses' days, around 1500 BC, but 500 years later. Others finally submitted those stories to writing. The earliest writing, so they say, came only in the days of King David, about 1000 BC. But did it really happen this way? Was Moses not able to write? And wasn't writing practiced in his days? Modern archaeology can answer these questions through the digs in the so-called tells. Close by Tel Mardik, a small village in northern Syria, we find one of those tells. It looks like a hill under which the remains of an old city are buried. In the period stretching approximately 2,000 years between Noah and Abraham, civilizations of unknown heights developed in the Middle East. In 1964, people started excavating this tell by digging carefully squares of 12 feet by 12 feet. Leading the team of archaeologists in Tel Mardik is Professor Paolo Martille, associated with the University of Rome. His specialized field is archaeology of the Near East. By Tel Mardik, the activities started around 1964. The hill covers an area of a little over 2 square miles, is oval-shaped, and has a diameter of more than 330 feet. In this tell, they discovered the remains of the old civilization of Ebla, and the most important find was the king's palace. About the discovery, Professor Mathieu commented,
"We have barely started our scientific investigation of the palace. Yet we only know a few of the locations, such as the guest room, some living rooms, the monumental gate, and especially the offices where the archives were found. But thanks to the archaeological evidence of Tel Mardik, and especially the information from the State Archive of Ebla, we can, in the coming years, rewrite and reconstruct the history of the 3rd millennium before Christ."
In Ebla's state archives, more than 16,000 clay tablets, which have been discovered so far, had been stored. Archaeology has long lost its reputation of treasure hunting. It is a science that uses many modern techniques. At Tel Mardik, many parts of once desirable pottery are sorted according to the layer in which they were found. After that, a rough description is made together with an accurate sketch. The thickness and curve of each piece is carefully measured, after which a picture is taken. All this information is cataloged in order to help to get a better impression of that era. In line with all this, Professor Mathieu tells about the enormous discovery of a few years ago.
Tel Mardik gained in importance when we, in 1975, discovered the state archives. The reason for this was that the clay tablets were written about 2,500 years before Christ. More than 16,000 tablets have been recovered so far, but most probably we will find many more.
Not just in Ebla were these clay tablets found, but everywhere in the Middle East. Thousands of clay tablets in many different languages were discovered. Yet those found in Abla seem to be the most important in terms of biblical history. For the first time, names of cities are mentioned that we have known from the book of Genesis, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, and also Haran, the city where Abraham had lived. Dr. Friedman, publisher of the magazine The Biblical Archaeologist, says,
It's clear from the Ebla picture that other cities were very much like this. After all, the Ebla scribes didn't just write to each other, and tablets must have been sent abroad and received from abroad, so that if we were lucky enough, we could expect to find similar archives, maybe not as large, at other cities in the Near East. The city with which the patriarchs are associated mostly in Mesopotamia or Syria is the city of Haran, presently in modern Turkey, but it belonged to the same orbit, the same area that the city of Ebla did. In fact, the Ebla tablets mention Haran a number of times. There was contact between the two cities, and we know even something of the language spoken at Haran because of the special way it's represented in the Ebla tablets.
do we have to imagine Abraham and his forefathers as wandering nomads with goats and sheep as a group of illiterates? Abla puts an end to that impression. Abraham and those before him were people who communicated with highly developed civilizations, such as Abla, where writing played an important role. The possibility certainly existed that Abraham could have had things written down. This is why it justifies the conclusion that Moses, at a later date, had the use of written documents, rather than be dependent on word-of-mouth information. Clay tablets were possibly written by Abraham, written by Noah, Jacob, or maybe even by Adam. When Moses is finally in possession of these clay tablets, he arranges the information in the right order, so as to form the book of Genesis. After Genesis, in the Bible, there is the book of Exodus, the written account of the exodus of the people of Israel from Egyptian slavery through a barren desert for a period of 40 years. In the wilderness, Moses heard God speak, and he wrote down everything the Lord told him.
And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord, thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments.
Joshua, who succeeded Moses, led the people of Israel through the river Jordan into the promised land, and finally a nation finds its destination. In that land, flowing with milk and honey, the Israelites disperse. There is no central authority except in periods of need and distress as foreign powers seek to suppress the nation. In that period, you have the so-called judges who were raised up. The last of the judges, and also the most important, is Samuel. He founded a so-called school of the prophets, and with that, Israel commenced an era of prophets. They were going to play an important role in that nation's history, because after the last of the judges, Israel was governed by kings to be guided by the prophets. Often the kings had to listen to very solemn warnings and rebukes by the mouth of a prophet. The prophets not only spoke the word of God to the kings in Jerusalem, but they also wrote them down. God himself commanded that this should be done, for example, to Jeremiah.
This word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Take thee a roll of a book, and write therein all the words that I have spoken unto thee against Israel, and against Judah, and against all the nations from the day of Josiah, even unto this day. It may be that the house of Judah will hear all the evil which I propose to do unto them, that they may return every man from his evil way, that I may forgive their iniquity and their sin. Then Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord, which he had spoken unto him, upon a roll of a book.
With that, the second part of the Old Testament was established. It comes after the 5 books of Moses. First, the books of the so-called early prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. After that, the late or major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And finally, the 12 minor prophets. Then follow the so-called writings. Books such as Daniel, Esther, and Chronicles belong to that category and were written during and after the Babylonian captivity. To these writings also belong Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. And with that, the Old Testament is complete. The law of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. The completion of this book enabled the Jewish people to go through centuries of martyrdom, yet remaining as one people.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk to them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house, and on thy gates.
How the text of the Old Testament scrolls were handed down is a story all by itself. Obviously, until printing was invented, everything had to be done by hand. The rabbis had to copy the worn scrolls very carefully. Only an authentic manuscript could be used as an example, and not a single letter could be written from memory. The space in between the letters had to be like that of a hair, and the length of a sentence, exactly 30 letters. When the scroll was finally finished, the letters were carefully counted and compared with the original. The oldest handwriting, until recently, dated back to approximately 1000 AD. This meant we only had a fairly recent manuscript. How can we know for sure whether or not the rabbis did their work properly without any mistakes throughout all those ages of writing? Until 1947, we remained in uncertainty. But then the mountains of Judea gave away their secret. In 1947, Muhammad Adib, a young Arab boy, walked in the vicinity of Masada, close to the Dead Sea. He was looking for a couple of goats that he had lost. While looking, he peeks into different holes and caves in the mountainside and throws stones in them to find out whether or not one of his goats have wandered into one of those caves. As he throws a stone in one of the caves, he hears something rather unusual. It isn't the sound of a goat, but of breaking pottery. Next morning, as he returns with some friends, they discover a large quantity of earthen vessels and pots. Some were broken, others still in their original shape. The contents of those earthen clay pots and vessels is now carefully kept and guarded in a specially built museum in Jerusalem, the Shrine of the Book. From these clay vessels, there appeared very old scrolls with very old handwriting. They were the biblical manuscripts, the oldest that they have been able to find so far. These so-called Dead Sea Scrolls are more than 1,000 years older than the oldest handwriting ever discovered. And never before had a classical text over such a long period of time of copying and recopying remained the same. When the scrolls were compared with more recent copies of the same text, it became evident that the text had remained exactly the same. The work of the Jewish rabbis who copied the Bible throughout the centuries, word by word, is unique. God did not only give his word to mankind, but also made sure that it was not tampered with at all. 400 years before Christ, the whole Old Testament is completed in Hebrew. Shortly after, the world had to bow for a new potentate, Alexander the Great. His armies swept through the east and conquered many lands in the process. A Greek empire is established. The Greek language becomes part of those nations, including the Jews, both in and outside their land. The need is felt for a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Around 250 BC, this translation is completed, and the Septuagint is extensively used around the Mediterranean. The Old Testament is finished, and so is the Greek translation. All the preparation is done. The stage is set. The Messiah can come.